My name is Alyssa.
And I'm Tony.
And we are the Sultry Sisters. We're a community-based organization that empowers women to live healthy and creative lives in North County, San Diego, and recently, DC.
We curate events, workshops, mixers, and meetups centered around women's arts, wellness, and sisterhood.
Our mission is to empower women to live vibrant and shine bright through creative expression and conscious holistic living.
Our vision is to create a safe space that provides women the arts and wellness resources that are affordable and accessible.
So far, we've partnered with Dancing So Boutique, Village Rock Shop, Carlsbad Village Yoga Co-op, and nonprofit organization Leap to Success. To find out more information about us and to sign up for our future events, visit sultrysisters.com.
You can also find us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at Sultry Sisters.
We hope to see you soon.
Hey everyone. We want to wish you a happy International Women's Day. Woo,
Yes, so happy International Women's Day. So of course, as Sultry Sisters, an arts and wellness collective that's dedicated to women of color, this is a special day for us. So yeah, you all can comment below how you celebrated today, if there's anything special that you did or anything that you know that's going on.
Yes, let us know. And of course, we love to start our Sultry Sister Hangout with welcoming you all. We're going to be doing, continuing our book club series. So let us know if you're tuning in live, where you're tuning in from, and what you are sipping on. Yes. Let us know, Tony, where you tuning in from today.
Yes, so I'm tuning in from DC. It was sunny today, so I did a 3-point-something mile walk this morning while I talked to Alyssa. But it is still kind of cold, so it's spring, so some days are warm, some days are cold, but you can see the flowers starting to bloom, which is nice. And I am sipping on some hibiscus tea with some open heart herbal tea from Organic Olivia's line. So the open heart tea has like rose petals, hawthorn, I forget what else, but really nice things. And then hibiscus, of course. So kind of for Women's Day, kind of supporting a women-owned business, and then also some herbs that are really good for like women's wellness. But also my earrings are from Wires by PQ, which is a Black woman-owned jewelry brand. This Hamsa necklace is from Village Rock Shop. Of course, our favorite, one of our favorite women-owned businesses in the village. And then this Pisces necklace is from Femme Fatale, which is a woman-owned business out here in the DC area. So we're always celebrating women.
Tony, you are dripped down in all the women's stuff. I'm wearing my half moon earrings are from Village Rock Shop, so you know I'm repping too, and my top is from Girlfriend Collective. So yes,
nice.
And I'm tuning in from San Diego, and I'm sipping on some simple but cute and classy H2O.
Nice.
That's me today.
Yeah, I always have my backup water.
Of course, yeah. And I love. I don't know about y'all. Let us know in the comments if you like drinking water in a fancy glass. It makes a difference for me. All right, we have Kyle checking in from Virginia with some Irish black tea. Okay, some Irish black tea. I know about Earl Grey black, but not Irish black tea. I don't think I've ever had Irish black tea.
Nice.
And so if you are just tuning in and joining us this month, we are reviewing and going over the book All About Love by Bell Hooks. If you want to learn more about our book club, to join us, go to our website, sultrysisters.com/book club. You can see the details of like each episode and what we're going to go over. You can also catch the replays here on YouTube. So if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe. So every time we upload a new video, you can be alerted. And also we want to celebrate. We have 100 subscribers on YouTube.
Yeah.
Woo!
Yeah, so we just reached 100, and because we don't really post on YouTube much, but I think with our book club lives, you all have been tuning in either live or with the replays and subscribing so you can get the notifications. So thank you all. So definitely, share our YouTube with people that you know. If you're watching the live and you're not already, subscribe to our YouTube channel. But you can also find us on all platforms at Sultry Sisters. Um, and you can go to our website, sultrysisters.com/book
Mhm.
club to learn more about the book club, and stay tuned because soon we're going to announce what our next book club is. So we'll probably announce that next week. Um, but
Mhm.
but yeah, so let us know.
Yes, let us know. And now that we've all gotten settled in, we have our drink, we're going to be getting into this book all about love. So if you have the book and you're tuning in, you can have the book out because we're going to be sharing some quotes. If you're driving home or doing things around the house, you can listen to this like a podcast. Just find a different way, like whatever way that works for you to hang out with us. And now we want to kind of check in since we are talking about and continuing our March theme of the art of loving. We want to start our conversation and hang out with some grounding reflection questions. So we're asking y'all, what has your love practice look like this week?
Nice, yeah. So this week, my love practice looked like many things actually. So again, I've been doing my walking, so I've been consistent, which that has felt really nice. Um, Especially since the weather is starting to get a little bit more warm, the sun is coming out. So I've done my walking. I've been being in bed more. So I don't necessarily go to sleep early, but I've been in the bed longer,
Mm-hmm.
which is a step in the right direction if you know me. Um, so that's been good. And my love practice this week has also been like spending intentional quality time with folks. So I got to see some of my old coworkers from Guam. So I lived on Guam. I moved away in 2018. So it was about 5 years since I've seen them. So they're in town for a conference. So on Monday, I got together with them, and then we even FaceTime our old boss, Bernie, and then another coworker, Lawling. So it was really nice to see all of my coworkers, and it's just been so long. So it was just crazy how much time has passed, how much life has changed. But it's always those types of moments when you reconnect with people that just like warms my heart, and it's just like, oh, like even though time has passed, like it feels nice to connect with people who I consider them my family. Like everyone I work with and my friends on Guam were like my Guam family, so that was really nice.
I love that. And I really resonate with you because this week I've also, my love practices look like walking. But I've
Hmm.
also used that time while I was walking to catch up with friends. So it's like Wednesday, and each of my walks each day, I've called and caught up with a friend that I haven't talked to in a long time. So instead of my usual, which is like listening to music or listening to a podcast, I was like, let me use this time to catch up with a
Mm.
friend and a loved one, and that's been nice. And I've also I have a new walking path that I go on, and so it's been nice to like change it up a little bit. I walk by Carlsbad State Beach. That's a new. I love all beaches, but I like to explore like different boardwalks, and they have like a really nice like wavy, windy sidewalk where you're like up first and then down. I'll have to take Tony when she gets here, but yeah, that's been my love practice, like surprising myself and then also reaching out to friends to catch up during my lunch break.
Nice. And Kyle shares he's been taking walks still, doing yoga. Yes, so Kyle joined our Soul Flow yoga this past Sunday. So I taught yoga again, and finding some time to read just for pleasure. I love that.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I've been actually having I won't say a hard time, but the other books I've been reading outside of All About Love, nothing has really been sticking. I'll read a little bit of different types of books. So I am still kind of on the hunt for the book that's really just going to captivate me. But if you have any recommendations, put them
Yes.
in the chat below. But yeah, it has been something that I've been wanting to read more. But different books that I read, I just read a little excerpt. I'm like, oh, okay, that was fine. I'm not like,
And it's good to like honor yourself in that. Like, I think it's good to be curious about books. And I think certain books will gravitate towards us and open themselves up at the right time. Like, for instance, like this book has been on my shelf for some years now. This is actually, and it wasn't until last year that I finally read it. So, sometimes it's just like right place, right time, right moment in life. But yeah, like, should we get started into chapter 8, Tony?
So we want to do another reflection
Okay.
question. Um, so last week we kind of touched upon this, but in our yoga class also we um ask everyone like, how are you cultivating a legacy of
Mm.
love? And then this past week in our soul flow yoga class we touched upon the question of what parts of yourself will you expand into with love, right? So, what are the parts of yourself that you're wanting to expand, to send, to give more love to? So, that's another question.
Mm. I have an immediate answer because this is something that
Mm-hmm.
came up for me in therapy yesterday, y'all.
Mm-hmm.
So that last question is like, what are things we're gonna do to expand into love with? Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, what parts of yourself will you expand into with love?
Mm. So, I'm gonna expand into the part of myself that is the learner, the part of
Mm-hmm.
myself that is the beginner, and I'm going to challenge myself to try something new and put myself in a position where I'm a beginner. I haven't figured out what that is, but I'm opening up myself up to being to an experience. I want to expand lovingly into the unknown of like a new hobby. I haven't let me know in the comments if you have any recommendations, but my therapist is encouraging me to find more playfulness in spaces
Mm-hmm.
where I am the beginner, the learner, the receiver of guidance. Cause with Sultry Sisters and other spaces, I'm oftentimes the person leading and giving. And so yeah, I'm expanding into like the position of being the receiver and the position of like being guided and supported in something that I know nothing about. TBD. I'll keep y'all posted.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Um, yeah, I feel like for me, well, something I journaled the other day when we were in class was like, I'm expanding into loving myself through the down times or when there's like either less stuff that I'm doing or if something isn't going as well, to really like release the self judgment that either I should be doing more or that I should have done something differently. So sending love to those parts of myself that's like very self critical or judgmental.
Mhm.
Because I think we talked about this in last week or a previous session of like a lot of times we give other people love that's very, graceful, compassionate, forgiving, but not always for ourselves. Um, so yeah. So thank you all for sharing. You
Mhm.
can share more in the comments if you have any other reflections. And I put the question in the chat too if you wanted to see it.
We have Kyle sharing. I'm wanting to lean into more reading and writing for my own enjoyment rather than only towards something academic. I want to be I want that to be a soul care, a love practice for me. I love that. Yes.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah. I love that too. Yeah, and just more practices for self. That's how I'm feeling too. This year, I really wanted to cultivate more creative practices and tap into my creativity. So,
Mm.
I did get some new craft supplies the other day. So I'm gonna start, what do you call that? Keeping a journal of like creative
Mhm.
things because I have journals where I write, but
Mhm.
I don't always keep it in one place like the other types of creative expression I do.
Mhm.
So I'm going to try keeping it in a journal and see if that like feels better for me in my practice too.
Yeah, and the question too that you're offering down here is how are you cultivating a legacy of love? I like that invitation. And what we want to also share, like as we have our community discussions, like, if something resonates with you, feel free to write it down and like take a moment. Like we don't have to have the answers. But for me, like when I read that question, like I don't have the answer of how I'm necessarily cultivating it like precisely, but I do like the invitation to think about how we want to leave a legacy of love on this earth. So thank you for that
Yeah.
offering, Tony.
Yeah, so thank you all for sharing. So yeah, now we can get into chapter 8. So now last week we were halfway into the book. So now we're at the later half of the book. So things are getting juicy. So chapter 8 is community loving communion. So we can read the excerpt. So it's on page 127. So it shares community cannot take root in a divided life. Long before community assumes external shape and form, it must be present as a seed in the undivided self. Only as we are in communion with ourselves can we find community with others. So I'll repeat the last part again. Only as we are in communion with ourselves can we find community with others. So that is an excerpt from Parker Palmer at the beginning of the chapter as well.
I would like to park there. That for me really was really an interesting perspective and shift for me when it comes to community. Because when I think of community, I automatically think of Sultry Sisters and like the sense of offering, the sense of giving back, and that at the end, like only as we are in communion with ourselves can we find community with others. It really is really interesting because I always think outside of myself when I think community. I don't think about the reflection. But then honestly, when I think longer about it, I know that sultry is a reflection of our soul care practice and stuff like that. But I don't necessarily, when I think community, I think the word is give, not as community equals communion with self. So that to me was already like a shift in like what's like soul care, and how that can contribute to being able to, connect with others.
Yeah, and for me, I really appreciated this quote and this passage because it really does highlight how it's still important to be connected with yourself in order to connect with others, right? It's like when we're on this journey, if you're not, in tune with yourself, then how are you going to find people who are like-minded, who are aligned, right? I think that is why Sultry Sisters is so special because, our community members and ourselves are on this journey. So we align in many ways, right?
That's
Like
the
maybe not
word,
in all the exact
align.
ways, but we align. And that part of that is aligning your mind, body, spirit. So that's aligned. Then you can connect with others because you're aligned here first. So then you see those connections, right? You're like, oh, why do I feel so connected to this person? Like, sometimes we can't explain it in words, but we have this energetic, pull and connection with someone. And I think that does start with self because when you are with yourself, then you know what you like, what you don't like, what works for you, what you're interested in, what you want to explore, what you're healing, what you're creating. So then those communities, when they come to you, you can feel like, oh, this is for me, because you know who you are.
Exactly. I think it also comes into like when I think about being able to connect when you're at a community event or with others, like the more I feel like sure of myself, I'm able to talk about myself and connect with others. Like, when you're telling someone, hi, my name is, and I'm from here. And like, so there you have to, there's a level of sharing of yourself to have to be able to connect with others. And I think that comes with a communion of like feeling aligned and feeling invited to even share that part of ourselves. So I think it's like a little bit of those two layers of feeling aligned with the energy, but also knowing yourself so that you can communicate with others.
Yeah, that goes into something we read in Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown. I forget the exact parts we're talking about, but it's something around how when kids learn to like conform to the norm
Mm-hmm.
versus be like their individual selves. Like there's a thing of like belonging and then conforming or something like that. I don't know the exact quote, but she was saying like when you conform or you assimilate, it's like you're changing yourself to be like the other people to then fit in, right? Like when you think of school growing up,
Mm-hmm.
versus she said like belonging is like even you are your true self, your authentic self, and you belong in the community because everyone respects you, values you, and loves you as you are. So I think that's also kind of what
Yeah.
this quote is saying, is that like it's not about being just like everyone else in the community. It's like you are yourself first, and then therefore you can give and connect because
Mm-hmm.
you are yourself. So I think that's a part of it too,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like we value the individual versus valuing conforming to just a group think.
Right. It makes me think of like in yoga class or Pilates class that we teach for our soul flow is like inviting people to, do the moves that serve them and then come
Mhm.
back to the group. That's that communion and be able to practice in community with others. I feel like that's a really vivid example when I reflect on our class on Sunday. And then
Mhm.
Kyle shares, reading this now and based on some conversations I had this week, this reads as an invitation to make at least some time for solitude and self-checking
Mhm.
in, but in the context of community building. Ooh, yes, we're gonna get into
Mhm.
some quotes later. Yeah, I see that
Yeah.
too. Mm-hmm.
Mhm. Yeah, very, very on point of what
Solitude.
we're going to
Mm-hmm.
talk about in these next two chapters. So, yeah, so our reflections go into the next quote. So, there is no better place to learn the art of loving than in community, right? For all the reasons we just shared. And so, the first kind of topic area or theme from this chapter that we wanted to bring up is the culture of individualism and dependency, right? So when you think of community, what does that look like for you all? That's kind of what we're going to touch on with
Mm-hmm.
these next quotes.
Yeah, and then I think Bell Hooks at the beginning talks about like the family structure and all that.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the first quote I wanted to share is on page 130, and it shares capitalism and patriarchy together, our structures of domination have worked overtime to undermine and destroy this larger unit of extended kin. And
Mm-hmm.
I thought this quote really illuminates also what we discussed in Trisha Hersey's book, Rest is Resistance, when we've been talking about, unlearning grind culture and patriarchy and colonialism and white supremacy. And I felt like reading Rest is Resistance and now reading All About Love, like there's so much through lines through both of the books.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I appreciated Bell Hooks, bringing up how, these systems, oppressive systems, have worked to destroy community,
And
right? So
divide, yes,
yeah,
yeah.
divide. So that creates, the culture of individualism that's very prominent in westernized cultures, right? And not leaning on each other, being independent, like hyper independent in a way that's actually not helpful and could be, not serving us because we don't lean on community.
And I think her first example is talking about like a baby is born into community, and she uses the
Hmm.
example of the hospital. You have the doctors, the nurses, the all this full team with the mom for the first I don't know how many days because I've never experienced like a birthing, but um, and then after that, the mom and the nuclear family, the mom, dad, and the baby, and maybe some other tight knit family members come to the home, but it doesn't fit the same proportion as the team that brought in the baby, and that's what
Hmm.
breeds this form of like individualism. And then she also gives example of like the family being not a part of the extended family and the individual family forming dependency, so the woman having to depend on the man and the baby having to depend just on the mom versus being able to
Hmm.
depend on extended family, neighbors,
Hmm.
and a full community. So I thought that these were examples of her saying like this is like how we've had a lack of community in these cultural dynamics of individualism and dependency.
Yeah, so she talks a lot about like the nuclear family, what Alyssa just
Mm-hmm.
defined. So nuclear, as Hooks is defining, is just both parents and usually two kids.
Kids.
So just
Mm-hmm.
a small, a small family size. Um, yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And another quote that she shares towards the bottom of one page, page 130, is it is this dependency that we're talking about, this dependency that became is the breeding ground for abuses of power, right? So then
Mm-hmm.
that's when we start going into what does this look like when it means to love and have a loving connection when now there's patriarchy, there's power dynamics, there's all these oppressive systems that are now you only have one other
Mm-hmm.
person, your partner, and then a child, which is really hard, right?
Yes, exactly. And I like she's like so she's setting up the beginning of setting the stage of like what we're facing now. And then Kyle shares, in spite of this, people of color have always had thicker communities and community ties beyond the nuclear family. Extended kin and chosen family have definitely been important for Black folk. Yes, I think that's been a part
Hmm.
of our survival.
Hmm.
Like the history of leaning on each other. And yeah, I think she also talks about us having being outside of our nuclear family, how that if our nuclear family is like not healthy and doesn't
Hmm.
have the loving that we all deserve and have a right to, how outside of the family, maybe aunts and uncles, or even part of like community programs, maybe churches and clubs, you can find and kind of find that hope in the relationships outside of the nuclear family. And I thought that was like I really resonated with that as a person. Like for me and Tony, we grew up like military kids and always moving around. So we didn't
Hmm.
always have like our extended family, as in like our like our family, like our blood family, like aunts and uncles, but we always had like our community outside, or our chosen people to support
Hmm.
us.
Yeah, I think that's why chosen family is so important. And yeah, going back to, Black and brown communities have been doing this for survival because due to, chattel slavery and the transatlantic
Mhm.
slave trade, our families were separated purposely. So we could not have that strong bond and to have community, right? Like white supremacy, colonialism, slavery purposely oppressed
Mhm.
us in that way because they knew community was so important.
Mhm.
So also it was like during those times we did not have access to
Mhm.
blood relatives, right? Because they were sold off and et cetera, et cetera. But so yeah, I think our communities have been very innovative in what is community, what is family, and what is support. And so, yeah, for generations now, we have been creating community despite, white supremacy
Mhm.
wanting us to not be in communal spaces.
Right. Okay. Juice shares, everyone has cousins that they aren't related to.
Mhm.
Yes, exactly. And then Kyle shares, plug for Mia's Birdsong, How We Show Up. That dives into creating those bonds beyond traditional nuclear structures. Yes.
Mhm. Yeah, just on point, which goes into the next theme we wanted to bring up, which is community and communication. And so the quote we wanted to share is the family is a good place to learn the power of community, right? And for us, we're sharing like an expansive definition of family. So that goes beyond just a nuclear family, but
Mhm.
it could be, chosen family or whatever
Mhm.
that looks like for you. But yeah, I do resonate with this quote because I do feel like through community and through chosen family, you do learn like what does it mean to be a part of something outside of yourself, right?
Mhm.
And what does it mean to be connected to others?
And the next quote we wanted to share is, talking together is one way to make community. That's exactly, y'all, what we do here during our Soul Tree Hangouts live here on YouTube. We are
Mm-hmm.
creating community. It's so fun to see y'all's name pop up when y'all say where you're tuning in from, seeing the same names grow over time. So we definitely resonated with this quote. And then the next one we wanted to go into, this is where it comes into like talking about friendships. And I really appreciated the time that Bell Hooks took to talk and decipher friendship versus romantic relationships. And she goes, loving friendships provide us with a space to experience the joy of community in a relationship where we learn to process all our issues, to cope with differences and conflict while staying connected. And I really resonate with this because one of like, I have friends that I've had for a long time, like since I was, 5, years old. And through those, that long term, it doesn't have to be that long, but an example is like when you are, friends with somebody, you're gonna find times where you are going through something, and you're gonna find times where you might be growing apart. And I do feel like friendships, as we grow, whether that's through years or just a season in life, they do provide us a space to experience the community as we grow together.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think for me, I've had very many long-term deep friendships across my lifetime. Some best friends from like middle school. Like I
Mm-hmm.
still keep in touch with my first best friend when I moved out here to the East Coast, Kiana, Kiki. We're still in touch now. So yeah, I feel like in my life, loving friendships has been definitely a relationship dynamic that has helped me on my journey and that has been the most consistent. Like for me, my
Mm-hmm.
romantic connections have been fickle and come here and there. And then my family dynamic hasn't always been the most loving in the definition that Bell Hooks shares.
Mm-hmm.
So friendships to me is where I really have learned what love means, and how to show up in these ways that are loving. Yeah, so to me, friendships have been really important.
Mm-hmm. And that goes into the next quote. Friendship is where we have our first glimpse of redemptive love and caring community. Learning to love in friendships empowers us in ways that enable us to bring love to other interactions. I really feel that. Hmm.
Mhm.
When I think about like your first best friend, like the first
Mhm.
like that first closeness you felt, like I definitely feel like, yeah, that was the first time I felt love. Like mm, that was outside of being born into like, oh, I love you because you're my family, because it is your first chosen family. For me, was a
Mhm.
friend, my best friend.
Mhm. Right, and like bell hooks writes, is our first glimpse of redemptive love, right? And caring community. So what does that mean? Like, especially when you're younger, right? When you let someone borrow something or you
Mm-hmm.
invite them to like your party, or right, it's like you're learning those types of how to create and sustain those deep bonds. Um, and I like that she mentioned too that it empowers us, that
Mm-hmm.
then we bring that type of learning from this friendship to our other interactions. And she mentions also romantic bonds, right? So
Mm-hmm.
not only, so I think with society, we really prioritize and put on a pedestal romantic love, but I think Bell Hooks also trying to share like you are not going to be able to have a healthy romantic love if you don't have healthy relationships that are outside of that, right? So we talk
Mm-hmm.
about family relationships in the past chapters, and now she's talking about friendship, right? Like if you don't have healthy friendships, then how are you supposed to show up in a romantic connection healthily, right? And I think in society, people really don't like prioritize that. Like, no new friends, all those songs. And
Mm-hmm.
even, a famous YouTuber and now podcaster, Shannon Boodram, today she had a clip from one of her recent podcasts talking about how she doesn't really have many adult friendships right now. Um, and so I think it is really true. I think many people probably don't have deep, fulfilling, loving friendships. But I think instead of leaning on a romantic partner to fulfill you and to teach you in these ways and to help you grow, it's like, how about we lean into friendships, right? And like, how about we create new friendships as adults
Mm-hmm.
that are loving, right? Because it's going beyond just, oh, my best friend from elementary school that I've known for my whole life, but like we don't really click and we only hang out because we feel obligated. Like, no, that's not what we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about with friendships in Bell Hooks' definition. We're talking about friendships that are also equally loving as we have defined earlier. So I think that's also a shift, because I think some people are like, oh yeah, I have friends, but it's like, okay, you have friends, you have acquaintances, but do you have these like deep connections where you feel that like you can lean on them for support, that they're actually helping you grow, and that, you know, they're pouring into you as much as you're pouring into them.
Yeah, and I think it's leaning on to like that emotional part, and we'll get to that later
Mhm.
too. And it leads us into this next quote that in friendship we are able to hear honest, critical feedback. We trust that a true friend desires our good. And I feel like
Mhm.
that is like when you want to seek counsel from your friend, like, hey, like, how does my outfit look? Or, hey, like, can you read my resume? I'm applying for this new job. I think friendship, like it's where we learn to not take things personal and allow someone to really give us that feedback on how we're showing up.
Mhm.
Especially like if you have a friend and you also like, for instance, I have growing up, I had dance friends, then I had my at home neighborhood friends, and I found myself like sometimes venting to either or about like, oh, I'm having trouble with this other friend, and then they would actually help me to be a better friend to another friend by pointing out maybe things I didn't notice. And I realized like that was kind of the first time I got like honest and critical feedback, is when I was, talking to my friends about my other friends, not like talking about their back, but like, oh, how do I, navigate telling this friend like I need this thing back. So I feel like for me, I've always leaned to friends to really help mirror what I sound like and how I'm showing up. And I've been able to receive that better than from like a more authority figure or someone who I don't
Mhm.
have that bond with.
Mhm. Yeah, and Kyle shares, right? In addition to putting romantic relationships on a pedestal, we put unrealistic expectations on them
Mm.
regarding conflict in monogamous contexts. With friendships, we give more space to grow into love. Yes,
That
there's a thought I
part.
just had in my
Part.
head, because I was like, yeah, with friendships, right? I feel like it is more natural, or more I feel like we're more accustomed in friendships to work through things, right? Versus now, I feel
Mhm.
like these days with dating, people are like, oh, one conflict, oh well, I'm done with you, I'm just gonna go find another person, like I'm not gonna communicate because they should already know. It's like, why do we expect, romantic connections to already know these things, or not have conflict at all? Like, we think it's going to be a fairy tale, like, oh, you find your person, your soulmate, and there's no conflict ever. But it's like, even with our bestest friends, our soul sisters, all these things, there
Mhm.
will be conflict. And that could be a range of things, but it's just like we do learn to. She talks about the book of like, you learn that, to bring it up in a way so you can work through it together. And I feel like, yeah, with friendships, it is more so common to be like, oh, we're working through this thing, or to
Mhm.
even feel
Give
comfortable.
space.
Yeah, to even just feel comfortable to
Mm.
bring something up. I feel like it's more common in friendships than other other connections.
Yeah, and that goes into this next quote is like, when we love when we love as the will when I think I messed up this quote, but when love is the will to nurture one's own and another spiritual growth revealed through acts of care, respect, knowing and assuming responsibility, the foundation of all love in our life is the same. And I loved how she
Hmm.
was saying that whether it's romantic or friendship, the foundation is the same. It's going to be
Hmm.
care, it's going to be respect, it's going to be knowing and assuming responsibility for that person.
Hmm.
And that for me was like, yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, and I don't feel like that is said enough. Like they are equally important in our
Yeah.
lives.
And I think in the book too, she shares, kind of, she goes more into detail about how she was in a relationship, like a long-term relationship that wasn't healthy, it wasn't loving in this
Mhm.
way, but she didn't realize it as soon because she was isolated, because she didn't have community, because she put this relationship on the pedestal, like how society, then your romantic person becomes your everything, and you're just, thick as thieves, attached at the hip. And so she felt like if she had known, if she had known to keep her friendships just as important to her,
Mhm.
then maybe she would have realized that it wasn't as healthy and left the romantic relationship sooner. So she was like, oh, if I had people in my life that maybe could have told me, hey, this probably isn't healthy, or even if I had another example to compare it of like, oh, my friends are showing up for me, respecting me, caring for me, showing me care, but then my partner's doing this, like, why do I put them up here and if they're giving me more? So I appreciated her sharing her example too, because I think I have had many friends like
Mhm.
that who get in a romantic relationship and then you like don't see them, don't hear them
Mhm.
about them. And then when they break up, then they're like, hey, let's go out, let's hang out. And it's just like, why didn't you
Yeah.
keep this friendship
Well,
when you were with your person?
yeah, and that comes to the like what we were talking about earlier is like that individualism and like specifically the dependency, not individualism, excuse me, that
Mhm,
dependency that is created when we isolate ourselves in a relationship. And I've also been on both sides, like when people, after their breakup, they come back and say, oh, the reason why I stopped reaching out was because I was going through a hard time and I didn't know how to share that. So that shows like not only were they not able to share that communication, that honesty with the partner, they didn't even have that in their friendships. So it's
mhm,
like that's why in between breakups, it's so important to like go back to that solitary time, but also nurturing those friendships and keeping them
mhm,
because when you don't have those friendships, it's really hard to get that feedback, to have that,
mhm,
critical eye. And sometimes those when you don't ever, when you go into a romantic relationship without the strong friendship bonds, it's hard to create that after the fact. So that's why during
mhm,
these breaks in relationships, in my experience, um, I've had, I've personally chosen to focus on my friendships
mhm,
in the attempt to have that support, have that level, so that I have that comparison because I've been that person. I've been there, y'all.
mhm. Yeah, and that makes me think of the term relationship anarchy. So I don't know if you are familiar. I'm pulling up the definition now so I don't get it wrong. But relationship anarchy is a way of approaching relationships that rejects any rules or expectations other than the ones the people involved in agree upon. And in my experience with relationship anarchy, I was introduced to the term through my pleasure herbalism class with Hood Herbalism. So there's people in there that identified as relationship anarchists. And so they were sharing, and I was very curious. And once they shared their definition of like, yeah, relationship anarchy is just going against the cultural norm and societal norm that your romantic partner has to be the top priority in all your
Like in a
relationships.
pyramid.
Yeah, in a pyramid. And that you can have, your, sibling bonds be really high. It can be a best friend bond, right? I feel like many people will joke about their best friend being their life partner, but when it comes to actually living out the relationships, they don't necessarily always act according to that value belief,
Mhm.
right? So I do now subscribe to relationship anarchy because I feel like that is how I have lived my life for a long time. Is my sister, she's one of my like life partners, especially now that we're business owners. A lot of my best friends, right, have been through we've been through life together since like middle school and stuff like that. So it's just like, if these people have been around all this time, why am I then going to, like, I guess for lack of better words, demote them because this
Mhm.
other person came in my life? Like, no, like, how about everyone is important to me and all of those relationships look like what they do for each
Mhm.
core connection, right? So I just want to offer that for people too who are kind of like, as we're talking about like relationships and kind of getting out of the norm. Relationship anarchy is another thing you can look into, and I'm sure there's books and stuff about
Yes.
it.
And that like, actually goes into the next quote of like values that inform our
Hmm.
behavior when rooted in a love ethic are always the same for any interaction.
Hmm.
So you're going to treat everyone with that same intention and give them the same attention when they are showing a need for you in their life. When someone's sick, when
Hmm.
someone needs, something, we're able to prioritize that because they are an important person in our life. So I feel like that's this quote like totally supports exactly what you were talking about.
Yeah, and I feel like values is important. Like I just love the language of this quote too. It's like
Mm-hmm.
values that inform our behavior, right? So if you say you value your deep relationships in your life, but if your behavior says something else and your behavior is that you're leaving your important people behind, then that's not aligned, right? So I think that's another thing to check in with
Yeah.
yourself too when you're in any type of relationship is like, am I acting according to my values
Mm-hmm.
in this situation. And then also when she says when it's rooted in a love ethic, right? So what are your values? Are they, the art of loving? And what does this mean for my connections and my relationships?
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like this quote is really, really important to kind of ground us. And like when we talk about community too, right? Like what are our values? And I think that is why we feel so connected to the important people in our lives because we share, values and we act and behave according to similar value systems.
Mm-hmm. And as we're talking about our friendships and bonds, we also want to talk about forgiveness. And this next quote is forgiveness is an act of generosity. I love that. By forgiving, we clear a path on the way to love. You know, when we're practicing the art of loving and building these bonds with folks and really trying to honor
Mhm.
ourselves and honor someone else's values, we're not always going to get it right. So I love how Bell Hooks invites forgiveness as part of, you know, how we love and how we expand
Mhm.
ourselves and how it's an act of generosity, and it's something we do when we want to practice love and when we want to
Mhm.
work our way to having a loving relationship.
Yeah, and she has like other passages about forgiveness. And what I really appreciate about her going into that was like, we talk about community, right? She's like, it's not about just when things are flowery, glittery,
Mhm.
rainbows, right? It's like community is working through these things, right? And when we talked about the quote of talking builds community, you also have to talk through these difficulties and these conflicts. And that part of that is forgiveness, right? And I appreciate that she said it clears a path on the way to love. I just thought
Mhm.
of like your heart, then expanding when you forgive to clear that path for more love
Mhm.
to come in. So I visually thought of that. Especially right when we say in the songs like no new friends, and like why do people usually say that? Because probably there was a conflict or something that they weren't able to resolve. And right, some things are you won't be able to resolve, but I think there's still certain aspects of forgiveness and communication that is important even if you choose to end a relationship or end being in community with someone. And I think, yeah, forgiveness and
Mhm.
communication, I feel like are not talked about as much when it comes to community building in general.
Mhm. And this next quote that we're sharing is talking about being by oneself. And so, Kyle, this is kind of coming back to what you shared earlier:
Hmm.
is knowing how to be solitary is central to the art of loving. I love that too. That's like
Hmm.
with self, the communion with self. When we can be alone, we can be with others without using them as a means of escape. To
Mm.
that, y'all, perpetually needing to be with others, not being able to be oneself like it stops us from being able to, be practice the art of loving. I love that because I feel like a big coping mechanism sometimes with breakups or a break in communication. Say if like you're not getting along with someone, you're gonna go and hang out with somebody else, like fill in
Mhm.
the void. So I also appreciated this was a full stop for me to be like,
Mhm.
knowing how to be solitary. So, for example, let me use the example of
Mhm.
like if for romantic dating, people who go to like serial relationships versus allowing self to be solitary so you can really be intentional. Same thing
Mhm.
with being solitary with your time, like taking your time for you.
Mhm.
And when you have time for yourself, you can choose who to invite to
Mhm.
spend time with you versus anytime I'm free, I'm with so and so, whether that's a friend or a
Mhm.
romantic. It's like if you have that solitary, like independence, we're able to engage and really pick and choose how we share our time with others when it's centered around
Yeah.
ourselves.
And I think I know people do genuinely believe in, like, being introvert or extrovert or ambivert and those types of things. But I do sometimes question people who are like, oh, I just only can be around people. Like, it's just really tough for me to be by myself. Because there's a difference between extroverts who are like, oh, I really just enjoy being around people, and people who are like, I can't be by myself. Because people who use being an extrovert as a mask, sometimes I'm like, well, do you ever have time by yourself? Like I know you can find joy and it can be fulfilling to be around others, but you shouldn't like feel like, like a really negative feeling to be by yourself. And I think sometimes those folks that I have talked to, it's because they're like running away from something, right? Trying to escape or not really wanting to hear the thoughts that come up when they're by themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's just like if they're not doing this work, then it is probably harder to be by yourself. Because you don't want those moments to come up for to push you to do the work. You want to just be with others. So you're just like, oh, just getting their energy, getting their attention, maybe too. Like maybe you really thrive on attention, but like that could be healthy, but also it can lead to very unhealthy patterns and behaviors too.
Mm-hmm. And on the latter of being like solitary, the next quote is, our willingness to make sacrifices reflects our awareness of interdependency. So when we talk about community, right, being able to show up for others, and sometimes that does involve making a sacrifice. Like say if,
Hmm.
Tony called me and I was like in the middle of like a bath, but she needed me, I'd be like, all right, I'm going to get out of this self-care mode and I'm going to go help her,
Hmm.
because the awareness of interdependency, that we are connected to one another, the interdependency of being family, when Tony was talking about being family outside of oneself. And so that's what this came to mind, is like, yeah, like making sacrifices is our awareness of interdependency. And it is a choice, because it's our willingness, a
Hmm.
will, that action that she's talking about,
Hmm.
love. When we choose to love someone, we're choosing to have a willingness to make those sacrifices and give them attention, even when it's not at the optimal time for us, because we know that we would want that in return at some point.
Yeah, and also I think of, right, when it's talking about like it means to sacrifice being in community, and that's why it's so important to have your self-love practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're pouring into yourself, if you're doing your soul care, then if someone is asking for something, you can support them because you've already filled your cup up, right? Versus if you're just always constantly doing for other people, then when another person asks for something, you're like, oh, I can't do that, or you're going to feel so spent doing it. Versus if you also have the practice of pausing, connecting with yourself, then that sacrifice doesn't feel so like suffering, right? It feels
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, this is a part of me being in community. um and yeah, and then I feel like just going back to like the solitary theme, like I wrote down in my book, like I am not alone, I am with myself. And because I do spend a lot of time with
Mm.
myself, and a lot of people always are like, oh, you're gonna do this thing alone, like why are you, like, do you want me to come with you? And I'm like, no, I am fine. Because I enjoy my own company and I am not by myself, I'm with myself, right? So I'm not alone, I'm with myself, so I'm with my own company. I'm checking in with my mind, my body, my heart, my spirit. So that's why it is very fulfilling for me, because there's so much going on here, right? Like when is
Mm-hmm.
the last time, if you're always doing something for others, when do you get the time to check in with yourself? So that is why it is so important and so fulfilling to me, because I get a chance to check
Mm.
in. And that's why that's a part of it too.
I love that. When I'm with myself. I'm not alone. I'm
Mhm.
with myself. I love that.
Yeah. So that goes into the last quote of chapter 8 that we wanted to share is, whenever we heal family wounds, we strengthen community, right? So in the book, we've talked about, the family dynamics, what that looks like, how that can show up for us, and how that can affect our adult relationships, whether that's romantic or friendship. And so now she's talking about, like, okay, if you heal these family wounds, if you heal these community wounds, right? Because family is community. Um, we strengthen our community. So I think
Mhm.
that's so important, especially, Soul Tree Sisters as a collective. When we talk about collective healing,
Mhm.
that is also a part of, maintaining our
Yes.
collective well-being is through healing as a
Mm.
collective or individually, and
That
that helps heal the collective. Yeah.
this quote makes me think of restorative justice.
Hmm.
Mhm. Like, the intention of having that restorative justice is to strengthen the community, is to, address the harm and move forward.
And also, it makes me think of intergenerational trauma or intergenerational
Mm.
healing. When people are saying, like, oh, I'm healing, my grandmother's wounds or all these other things, I very much resonate with that because,
Mhm.
we're somatic practitioners as well. So we do believe and practice things that are, the body does hold a lot of these things. So, yeah, I think through healing those things, then we can open ourselves to expand, to receive love, and to pour love into others as well. Yeah.
Before we get into chapter 9, we do want to share that we are hitting our hour, but you know how we do. We love
Mhm.
taking our time. We love sharing our reflections. So at this time, if you need to fill up on your water, if you need to go to the bathroom, do so. If you're on your phone, take us with you. You can be mobile, but we're gonna continue to go into chapter 9
Oh, wait,
with
before, because
oh,
Kyle has a comment we didn't get to. So before we go to
okay.
the next chapter, so Kyle shares forgiveness is essential for transformative justice, and it takes a lot of non judgment and being able to see outside of yourself to see
Mm,
what led a person to make the choice they made. But that's tough. Yes. So
mm,
transformative justice, yes, is a part of collective healing, right? And it does take effort. It's not the easier route, but I do believe that that is more so towards the path of collective liberation is through approaches of
mhm.
transformative justice. Yeah. Thank you for sharing, Kyle.
Thank you for sharing. Chapter 9, Mutuality, the Heart of Love. This was a good chapter, y'all.
Yes, these
We
two chapters are very, very
they
almost
are a
same.
pair. Okay. Miss Miss Bell Hooks was really setting us up. I was like, and what I loved about these chapters is it's so heavy on the anecdotes, and at the end, it's giving those
Hmm.
dropping those gems. So at the beginning, you're like, oh, you're just getting these examples, y'all. So chapter 9, Mutuality, the Heart of Love. I'm going to read the opening quote. The true giving is a thoroughly joyous thing to do. We experience happiness when we form the intention to give in the actual act of giving and in the recollection of the fact that we have given. Generosity is a celebration. When we give something to someone, we feel connected to them. Ooh. And our commitment to the path of peace and awareness deepens. And
Hmm.
so let's park on when we give something to someone, we feel connected to them. I feel
Hmm.
that. I feel that if your love language is gift giving or gift receiving, like that's an
Hmm.
example, but it doesn't have to be a gift. That's just like one example, but I definitely feel that
Hmm.
when you give someone a hug, you
Hmm.
feel connected.
Yeah. And yeah, I did, like, one of the things I thought of with this quote was like giving physical gifts because I do know sometimes, when you give someone, like, let's say, like, if someone gives me this necklace and they see me wearing it, then you're just like, oh, I feel connected. Like, I feel like I'm there with you because of this thing. So I feel like that is one of the things, right?
Mhm.
That helps you feel connected, or when, a loved one passes away and then you're able to keep some of their
Mhm.
items, like, as a token to remind you and to connect you to them, right? So I do think sometimes physical things can be helping us feel connected to people, but yeah, it goes beyond that as well. But it did make me think of, like, oh yeah, sometimes holding on to different things um, is
Mhm.
very special.
Yeah, and I feel like giving is a form of care. So that's a part of
Hmm.
love too. And this chapter
Yeah.
with mutuality, talking about mutuality, she opens with talking about power and emotional attachment. Oh, I think we have a comment from Josh. Not by myself,
Yes.
with myself. That's a great reframe. Yes, yes,
Yes.
definitely.
Yeah, I hope you all can use
Yes.
that as you may, as you would like.
Mhm.
But
And
yeah, go ahead.
and so the example that Bell Hooks gives, and she's talking about the dynamics between um male and female, but then she ends it with love will not prevail in any situation, either male or female, when they want to maintain control.
Hmm.
And I really appreciated that because like, that power dynamic in relationships, that's often the downfall of like not wanting to be vulnerable, not wanting to um, you know, talk about your pain points and move past. I think it has a lot to do with wanting to maintain and keep power when really all we want is that emotional attachment. So
Hmm.
sometimes when there's a lack, we will hit it with the opposite. And you know so I really appreciated this quote to kind of open up like um that thought.
Yeah, which goes into the next quote when you talk about control. So the next quote is sharing the practice of love offers no place of safety. We risk loss, hurt, pain. We risk being acted upon by forces outside of our control, right? So, yeah, when people
Are
feel like we
resistant.
talked about in the beginning of the book, how in society, people aren't as open to love anymore because they feel like, oh, I can't control this. Like, I'm going to get hurt. Like, oh, I don't want that. Like, let me just, work hard, grind culture. I'm going to grind all day. Um, and I feel like that is because, people aren't aware of this
Hmm.
passage right here with the practice of love
Yeah.
offers no place of safety. And that's what
Hmm.
I've shared with like my close friends. Like, if they're going through a breakup or if I've gone through a breakup, it's just like I have come to in my journey to know and have realized that that is a part of love, right? Is that process of you open yourself up and you make yourself
Hmm.
vulnerable. And sometimes it doesn't work out. And sometimes, you do lose people, and that could also be, grief from losing a loved one. Like if they die, that could be from, moving away and you have to lose friends because you have to like be
Hmm.
in a new environment. A lot of different things. But yeah, there is loss and hurt when you love because you have opened yourself up. And so now once you're open, right, if it's no longer there, you will feel, a lot of emotions. But I try to encourage myself and others that like that's a part of the process and that's the beautiful thing of life is that
Hmm.
we get to love, and that we get to do it as much as we want, right? We can love
Yeah.
abundantly, many, many, many people. Like, there's no limit. It's not like you can only have 5 loving relationships in your life at a time. Like, you
Hmm.
can have many, right? It'll look different and how you show up in them, but it doesn't stop you just because you have one love romantically and that doesn't work. It doesn't mean, oh, your cap, like,
Hmm.
there's no limit to it, really.
Exactly. And I love this next quote too because as a person who let me just read it to y'all. When someone has not known love, it is difficult for them to trust that mutual satisfaction and growth can be the primary foundation in a coupling relationship. When you're
Hmm.
talking about power and emotional attachment, like how many of us try to, avoid relationships because you're thinking like you're not going to be mutually satisfied or you feel like
Hmm.
they're going to oh
Oh no! Oh no!
the universe is like tell it again. Say it. Say it. Hold on. Let me fix this. I'll be back.
Oh gosh. If y'all are new to social hangouts, you are not aware, but Alyssa used to always have something where she's either falling out of her chair, something's falling on her, she's falling off of something. So this is kind of a tradition.
That hasn't happened in a while.
I
Y'all, we
know.
was on a stride. All right. Um, what was I saying?
You were talking about being someone who you were saying how like you're sharing your personal
Yeah,
reflection.
I really appreciate his offering. Like, consider that the primary foundation in having a coupling relationship can be mutual satisfaction and growth. Like, you can both be satisfied. And I've always felt like me as a person who's been
Mhm.
single for like almost 5 years, I've always felt like I don't want to compromise, and I feel like I'm growing my growth is happening and I'm afraid of losing that growth. But with this quote, it was like, you know, like it might not be, it might actually expand that. It might actually add to that. It might actually create more abundance. And I was like, okay, Miss Hooks, I see what you're trying to offer here. She's trying to open me up.
Yeah, and I think also on that page, like she's talking about how like if we don't know love in childhood as well, that like we're not going to feel safe to open our hearts for love. I think that's really important too. Is like to acknowledge that our past experiences, whether through childhood or early life, that they do shape us, right? So there is going to be unlearning and healing that we need to do to open up ourselves, right? So she's not sharing that like you're just going to wake up and know how to love, right? We talked about that in the childhood chapter, that no one knows love innately. You are shown it and modeled it. And so I appreciate her saying that, like, you might feel unsafe, right? And not feeling unsafe doesn't mean it's impossible to feel love. It just means you might have to work through it in ways that make you feel safe again, right? Maybe that's taking things slow. Maybe that's communicating more, whatever that looks like for you. But once you build that trust, right, which is so important, through communication, through respecting each other, through showing up in that loving definition, then you can feel this abundance of love.
Right. And that goes into the next quote, like, to practice the art of loving, we have to first choose love. So it's like coming from that. If you've never known love, if you want to practice it, you must choose it. Admit to ourselves that we want to know love and be loving, even if we don't know what it means. So that is that risk of loss. That's that risk to get hurt. That's that vulnerability. That's that surrender. And I'm like, ooh, that surrender.
Yes, love is definitely a practice of surrendering, right? Because you don't know, right? Like it's a vulnerable place. You're trusting in someone else. And yeah, and like you have to admit it, right? I think we talked about this in one of the beginning chapters of like, in society, we don't want to share that we're searching for love or yearning for love. But admitting that, right, as she's saying, that like opens you up and opens others to know that, oh, you're willing, you're open to receive love, or I want to pour love into you. So yeah, but I want to take a moment to acknowledge some of Kyle's comments in the chat. So Kyle shares, power and energy struggles are a big source of conflict in all relationships. Celestine Prophecy and The Seed of the Soul both talk about this a lot. Yes. Real mutuality is maybe a cure for that, right? Yes. So if there's mutuality, like we'll talk about this in a little bit later with some of the quotes, but yeah, I think that is important, is to find that balance and that flow, and also to let go, I think, of what ideas people have of what love looks like, because I think a lot of what people think love looks like is power dynamics, and control. Because even when those books, those self-help books of like, how to get a man, how to keep a man, or whatever, all those books, insert the actual titles, but a lot of them are more so just power struggles, right?
Yeah, and I was like, we're like, oh, he's so jealous. He loves me so much. He doesn't want to lose me. I'm like, okay, like that's power.
Yeah, or we talked about in another chapter about when lying, right? Being dishonest as a way on both sides,
manipulation,
like both genders, like using, being dishonest as a way to manipulate and to control a situation, right? Like, oh, I'm not going to tell him the full truth because XYZ thing. It's like, maybe just be honest.
Yeah, and Kyle, I also agree. I think mutuality is the cure, because the title, mutuality, the heart of love. I mean, Bell Hooks is dropping the gem at the beginning. She's like, this is the answer. Boom. These are the reasons why. Zoom, zoom. I mean, it's right there. She's like, I just want to help y'all love. And then this,
come on now.
This love expands our capacity for love. Yes, you have to love to expand. It's like practice. You got to practice. That she calls it a practice. And she says it. She calls it a practice because it's not about being perfect.
And I think also with Kyle's comment, love expands our capacity for love. Is like, right, like when Like we need nutrients for our body
Mhm.
to run, right? So our hearts need love to keep loving. It's like we can't pour from an empty cup, right? So you have to love yourself. You have to receive, authentic, true love to then pour love out, right? Because it has talked about in the previous chapters that this doesn't just innately come to everyone, right? Like you have to be nurtured in love and modeled love to then pour love into others. So yeah, I really appreciate that comment.
Mhm.
And so when we talk about, relationships, mutuality, then she goes into communication and listening. And so the quote I wanted to share is listening does not simply mean to hear other voices when they speak, but that we also learn to listen to the voice of our own hearts as well as inner voices. And I interpreted inner voices as like your intuition, things like
Mhm.
that, self talk. But yeah, when she's talking about listening, I was just like, this is so important. Because she's talking about communication. On 157, she also talks about choosing to be honest is the first step in the process of love, right? So when
Mhm.
you're choosing to be honest, so when you're communicating, but also when you're honest with yourself and really receiving what someone is saying, is important too on the path to love. Um, and yeah, so we can pause here and reflect on listening.
Yeah. I think that goes into that's being solitary, right? Like how
Mhm.
can we cultivate space to learn how to listen to ourselves? It's being with ourselves, right? It goes back to what you're saying, Tony. I'm not alone, I'm with myself. So I think that last part is what, like that last part of the quote made me think back to what you were offering earlier about being with
Mhm.
oneself enables us to hear our voice, like which voice is ours, and to decipher, to listen to our heart.
Mhm. Also on 157 she shares the first responsibility of love is to listen, right? So it's a
Mm.
responsibility, right? So like it's, what she's probably sharing is like it's another tenet of love, right? Is communication and listening, which is so important. Because yeah, like if you,
Mhm.
especially when you're talking about mutuality, right, like if you want to be heard, all right, I think a lot of us want to be heard. You have to also mutually listen to another
Mhm.
person. And I think that's why there's a lot of conflict in relationships, right? Because it is challenging to listen in her definition right here of like not just listening to them speak, but really listening, with our hearts,
Mhm.
when we're talking about love
Yeah.
especially.
And if you're like, I don't know, y'all, like, what do you mean, like, listen to my heart? Like, I don't know. This next quote might be helpful. Is
Mhm.
getting in touch with the lovelessness within and letting the lovelessness speak its pain is one way to begin again on love's journey.
Mhm.
I love this offering because like it's
Mhm.
not always, love doesn't always come to us out of like, that clear path. Sometimes we've gotten to a point where we feel like we're in this
Mhm.
lovelessness, we are defensive, we are no new friends, we are
Mhm.
like, I'm good by myself, so sometimes a way to get back on that path to love is to get in touch with like the lovelessness inside,
Mhm.
and how that's showing up, and that's the only way we can change it. And I'm like, I
Mhm.
resonate with that personally where I'm at.
Mhm.
It's like I gotta get in touch with my lovelessness
Mhm.
within and how I perpetuate lovelessness, because I want to be able to, if I want to attract love, that energy, I gotta get rid of this lovelessness. I gotta put love back in. So for me, I was like,
Yeah.
I really appreciate this invitation.
Yeah. And she shares, right after that quote, then she's talking about how in relationships, how one partner is hurting and they feel like their partner isn't listening to them and hearing their pain, and so that's where it starts to brew conflict.
Hmm.
And then she shares on page 158 that those of us who were wounded in childhood, often we were shamed and humiliated when we
Hmm.
expressed hurt. It was emotionally devastating when the partners we have chosen will not listen.
Mm.
Usually, partners who are unable to respond compassionately when hearing us speak our pain are unable to listen because that express hurt triggers their own feelings of powerlessness and helplessness. So I feel like that really grounds us in like the healing needs to be happening for everyone, right? Like,
Eh,
because if your partner's coming to you and expressing something that hurt them, a pain, something they're dealing with, and you're not able to receive that and you're triggered and then you block them, like, there's just so many layers that's going on, right?
well,
But I just appreciate that she grounds us that like this is because of, past experiences. Not
mhm.
saying that like people are not capable of listening. It's just that, past experiences are causing them to react and to block themselves off from listening in this way.
And that brings me back to that quote earlier, like forgiveness is an act of generosity. By forgiving, we clear a
Mhm.
path on the way to love. Like, so when you feel that way, when both parties
Mhm.
aren't able to hear and listen, we can neutralize, like, all right, let's come from a place of like, we want
Mhm.
this to be better. We want to move forward. Through forgiveness, we can get there.
And then another quote that I didn't put on here, but I'll read from page 158 again. It's when we are committed to doing the work of love, we listen even when it hurts.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll read it again. When we are committed to doing the work of love, we listen even when it hurts. So I think that's really when we're talking about relationships, deep relationships, long term relationships, is approaching these conflicts, these times of hurt, and listening compassionately, listening with an open heart and open mind, even when it hurts us, because going through that, moving forward through that, will expand us to more love, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciated that part too.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that. And that brings me to Kyle's comment. I think it is right that we need to start by hearing our own pain slash lovelessness with compassion. But people who can give you that when you can't give it to yourself are a blessing.
Mm,
Yes.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is so important. That's why we have multiple different deep loving
Mm-hmm.
relationships in our life, right? So maybe if one isn't working out in that way, that we have other examples of how people can pour into us in this way that Kyle, just described as the blessing, right? That like we're not depending on one person because other people can give us a model. So like Bell Hooks says, we can know if something isn't actually working. So we don't have to, I guess for lack of better words, like settle for something when
Mm-hmm.
we can get what we actually want when we do the work, right? And that made me kind of think of, I wrote in the book like a labor of love. When we talk about love, a lot of times we're like, oh, you have to put in work, it's a labor. And I sort of feel that, but I also sometimes I'm like, I don't, I feel like sometimes when people, I think when Hooks talks about a labor of love, she's saying like when you're doing the internal work, when you're on this journey.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in society, people take that and interpret it as like, oh, well, we have to work through this. So like, me and my partner, like, we have like these challenges, but like
Mm-hmm.
we're working through it, we're doing, but it's just like if it's not, similar value-based systems, if it's not nurturing each other's growth, what is the work we're actually doing here?
Yeah, and she says
And
it here too. Like the work is when we are committed to doing the work of love, we listen
mhm,
even when it hurts. So the work of
mhm,
love is the is contributing to one's spiritual growth. The work of
mhm,
love is respect, care, affection, knowing, assuming
honesty,
responsibility,
yeah,
honesty. So that's the work. The work is not it's hard because I'm going to what you were saying earlier. No, the work is upholding the value of
mhm,
love and having the integrity to practice love consistently with all your relationships. That is the
mhm.
labor of love, not necessarily like settling.
Yeah. And so I wanted to preface with that because the next quote I wanted to share, I wanted to give context. So the next quote is acceptance of pain is part of loving practice. It enables us to distinguish constructive suffering from self indulgent hurt. Right. So that's why I want to give that context because, like, she's not talking about, like, Oh, pain. So like, yeah, like either she don't mean pain as in abuse, because no, we talked about at the very beginning that love and abuse cannot coexist. So she's not mean pain as abuse. She's not mean pain as in violence. She means pain as in this constructive suffering of like, okay, there's a challenge. It's hurting to go through this, but having this loving practice, we can do it in a constructive way. And
Mhm.
also when she talks about it's not self-indulgent hurt, which I wrote in my book as self-sabotage, right? So when
Yes.
sometimes, like when maybe sometimes you fear things working out or you fear the potential of a relationship thriving, that then we self-sabotage as a way to already just get the pain out of the way, in quotes, get the pain over with because it's gonna end anyways. And she's like, also
Mhm.
like, no, that's not the pain she's talking about. It's like she's not saying self-sabotage your life away. She's like, no, like the pain is doing the work that she just defined.
Mm. Ooh, I like what Kyle is just adding to this
Mhm,
conversation. In capitalism, we've learned to associate labor with pain, um, disutility, and something you need to be compensated to do. But labor can be fulfilling,
mhm,
especially this
mhm,
kind of labor, right? Not pain for itself. Snaps to
mhm.
that.
Yes, I love that. Especially, yeah, like labor can be fulfilling. It's when we also talked about in a previous chapter
Mhm.
of like creating loving work environments, right? So
Mhm.
when we talk about creating loving work environments, right, it's like what type of relationship environments are we cultivating that are loving, right? Like as you mentioned in this or the previous chapter of like, if we had the same standards for our romantic relationships that we had in our friendships, in our family relationships, et cetera, maybe we would make different choices, right?
Mhm.
Like we shouldn't make excuses for people. If we have these values that we consider important in some relationships, then why does that not translate to all relationships, right? So I think this is, to me, this chapter has been very reflective for me of like, really, what does it mean to be mutual and what does that mean when it comes to love?
Mhm. And with the last gems of the chapter, we wanted to highlight loving abundantly. Like Bell Hooks rounds out this chapter with offering us some beautiful words that are encouraging. So the first quote that we wanted to share from chapter 8 is the practice of love takes time.
Hmm.
Like how humbling is that after like, oh my gosh, there's all these obstacles that get in the way of our relationships being fulfilling. It's like, how we were raised if we didn't learn love, like how do we confront our lovelessness? It's like, hey, relax. It takes time. Mm.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a life practice, right? It's like through living life, you will have these experiences. Um, and it takes time. And I just, yeah, I feel like that was very affirming to hear and reassuring to hear, to know that time is okay. And to not rush it either, right? Because I
Mhm.
think that's how we can sometimes maybe avoid some of this unnecessary pain and hurt,
Mhm.
from unhealthy relationships if we actually just take time to make sure that this is what we want, that this is nurturing us, that this is fulfilling us in all those ways. um
Something else I really appreciate about when Bell Hooks is talking about love, especially with mutuality and the community chapter, is she's showing there's many ways to practice love, whether it's in your
mhm,
friendships, whether it's in your communities or your family unit or your intimate relationships. There's multiple ways. In this next quote, she talks about generous sharing of all resources is one concrete way to
mhm,
express love. So you can generously share resources with the different people in your lives. Like
mhm,
that's just you can generally, give back or you can generously share your resources with your friends and family. And I really appreciated how she's offering so many different perspectives on practicing the art of loving.
mhm. And also, like when we talked about mutual aid, I think it was
Mhm.
last week, right? I
Yep.
think this quote also speaks to that, because generously sharing your resources as a community, right? That is love. So that is how we love our community, is through this generous sharing, right? And it can be very transformative. It can be very expansive. What does that mean to generously share, right? That can
Your
mean
time.
anything. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be many
Mhm.
things.
Mhm.
And then this next quote is um it's related to giving ourselves that grace that we're talking about. And she says, much it's not much is much of the anger and rage we feel about emotional lack is released when we forgive ourselves and others. So we're talking
Mm.
about loving abundantly. We need to love abundantly by giving ourselves grace, by having forgiving generously, and
Mhm.
understanding that, these times that we feel anger, it will signal like maybe there's an emotional lack, and we can, restore ourselves through loving practices versus the
Mhm.
lovelessness that we are taught with individualism and dependency and power and all that stuff.
Yeah. And again, with this abundance, goes into the next quote. Through giving to each other, we learn how to experience mutuality, right? So
Mm.
she just ties it in the end, right? She's just like, if y'all didn't get it by now, I'm
Pop,
wrapping it
pop,
up
pop,
in a
pop.
bow and sending it to you. So, yeah. And it goes into the next
Ooh.
quote. So, giving is the way we also learn to receive. The mutual practice of giving and receiving is an everyday ritual when we know true love.
Every day, y'all.
And I like that about everyday ritual because it's Soul Trace Sisters. We talk about rituals,
Mm-hmm.
so intentional practices, and the mutual practice of giving and receiving. And I think I really resonated with that. And in my book, at the end, like most chapters, I don't do it for every chapter, most chapters I will write some like things that came up to me that really
Mm-hmm.
stood out. So I did write mutuality equals give and receive. Needs of ourselves and others are met and nurtured and tended to. And then I kind of bulleted what does mutuality mean, or like what things come up for me. So I put forgiveness, time, work, labor, practice, which we just talked about, trust, pain that turns into pleasure and paradise, communication and listening, and respect. So I feel like that
Mm.
really is like ties up and sums up what we shared in this chapter of mutuality, and what that involves, what that entails. And so we wanted to close out the chapter with one last quote, and then we'll hear from you all. But Bell Hook shares, love is an action, a participatory emotion, right? So it's an action, it's a practice, and it's participatory, right? It's not just emotion that you feel, right? You have to
Mm-hmm.
do the work. You have to, have these behaviors that align with your values. You have to be mutual. You have
Mm-hmm.
to open your heart. You have to do the work. Like, I just
Exactly.
appreciated it so much. Yeah.
Yeah, because in the chapter she talks about like how people can sometimes face disappointment in love because it's just like movies and media has been a bad PR for love and made it
Hmm.
seem like it just happens. It's instantaneous. Like no work should be involved. It just
Hmm.
just hits you in the face and you have this feeling. And that's why I feel like, oh my gosh, her words, a
Hmm.
participatory emotion. It doesn't just flush over you. It's an action. It's a will. And that's why I
Hmm.
really appreciated like how it really rounds out this chapter of that love is a choice.
Hmm. Yeah. So we wanted to check in with you all on how you are feeling after reading chapters 8 and 9. So, chapter 8 was about community, and chapter 9 was on mutuality. Again, these are some of my favorite chapters of the book because I feel like not only do I really resonate with it, but I feel like it really goes deeper into what love can look like. So, the possibilities of love, and the practices that are needed,
Mm.
to show up in this way that's the art of loving.
Yeah. The thing that's coming up for me after reading these two chapters and discussing it with y'all is there's no shame in seeking love and affirming
Hmm.
ourselves in love. Like there's no shame in seeking it. And she talks about that.
Mhm.
And I really resonate with her. And there's no shame in affirming ourselves in love.
Mhm.
And I just was like, that's how I feel after
Mhm.
this is more hope,
Yeah. Mhm.
more connected to myself in how I can be more proactive with cultivating a loving practice.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And Kyle shares, he feels more committed to building and leaning into community.
Mhm.
Yes, you're in the right place.
Mhm.
Sultry Sisters, we're all about community, community building, collective healing. Um, yeah, so for me, after reading chapters 8 and 9, yeah, I feel very affirmed. I feel like I say that like almost every time we close out a session, but I do feel very affirmed that like this journey, right? That we are supported. Like we can use this book as a guide to, what love can look like in our lives. Can use it as a resource to check in with ourselves, right? This is like the third time I'm reading this book, because it's just full of knowledge and wisdom, and points for me. I feel like I just am very reflective when I read this book. Like Alyssa and I this morning were talking about how like these two chapters really resonate with us with what was going on in our personal lives this past week, and we were wondering like, oh, is it the book is reflecting what's happening in our lives, or is it because what's going on that when we read this chapter it just clicks more? Like we did have that personal question with each other, like if I wasn't reading this book, would I have had these same downloads, right, these same reflections?
Mhm.
But I think that's the beauty of community, right? Of like sharing with each other, whether that's personally as sisters or that's with this shared space of our book club, is sharing in that communal practice of just being together, as we heal, as we connect, and build this community. I appreciate you all for being vulnerable and sharing, what's coming up for you all. We really resonate with it, and we appreciate your input. And even when you all watch the replays, when you leave your comments, we read those too. And it means a lot to us. So, yeah, thank you all. We'll continue with the book, of course.
Mhm.
So, next week we'll read chapters 10 and 11. So if you're not already, definitely go to our website, sultrysisters.com/book club to get up to date on everything happening. Subscribe to our YouTube at Sultry Sisters. Thank you
Mhm.
all have subscribed already. But we really have other stuff on there too. We have the replays of our previous book clubs. We have some movement practices because March is also Mindful March Madness. So
Mhm.
if you're interested in moving and grooving with us, check out our YouTube, check out our website. You can join our Sultry Sanctuary, which is our membership online
Mhm.
platform. And yeah, follow us on all platforms at Sultry Sisters. And we will see you all next week for more love and more light. So see you all. Bye.
Bye.